Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, kaki mai, kia ora i te iwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We do 30 minutes with one guest and no cuts, so what we record is what you get. Is democracy in retreat and autocracy on the march? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and dozens of other countries have headed down this road. Is America under Donald Trump heading in the same direction? When it comes to autocrats, Anne Applebaum wrote the book. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and staff writer at The Atlantic, and her book, Autocracy Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World, reveals the playbook of the strongmen who seek to upend the international order. What is it that they're after? What unites the members of this club? And how do countries that want to preserve democracy fight back? Let's start the clock, 30 minutes, with Anne Applebaum. Anne Applebaum, welcome to 30.
Thanks for having me.
We'll start with the key ideas in your book, Autocracy Inc. I want to then find out what you think where Donald Trump's America fits into that, and perhaps we'll finish with the impacts on smaller democracies such as New Zealand. So when we look at autocracies, let's deal with the what question first. I mean, you write about autocracies pushing back against transparency and accountability, depriving their citizens of influence and repressing anyone who challenges them. Are those sort of qualifying characteristics of autocracies?
One of the key things to understand about modern autocracies is that they have many different ideologies. There can be communist China, you have nationalist Russia, you have theocratic Iran, you have Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, you have whatever North Korea is. And all of them, nevertheless, have certain things in common. Some you've just mentioned. They all seek to rule without checks and balances, whether it's a leader or a ruling party or a ruling clique. They seek to rule without legitimate opposition. They seek to control the information space. Very often, they control all or most of the economy, or the commanding heights of the economy. They want to have, or they aspire to have, all of the country inside a kind of a system that is theirs, and that's what links them, and that's the idea that they all share.
We mentioned Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. You write about perhaps 36 other countries as well. So you're looking at 40 plus countries in this meeting these sort of characteristics. Is autocracy on the march, do you think?
It's certainly true that the wave of democracy that we experienced following the revolutions of 1989, at some point over the last couple of decades, drew to a halt. And a lot of existing dictatorships consolidated. So in some cases, directly because they were afraid of the language and ideas of democracy and of freedom and of the rule of law that they heard coming from the liberal democratic world. So they began to consolidate, they began to work together. At the same time, you've had several countries that could have been democracies or even were democracies make a choice to move in the other direction. And that's Russia is one, Venezuela is one, Hungary is one, and there are a handful of others. And so, although I don't think that there's anything inevitable about this trend, I don't think it's written in stone somewhere that it has to go this way. It's true that they have begun over the past decade in particular to learn from one another and to borrow tools of control and of information warfare from one another. And they begun to work together in ways that reinforces them. So that's, I think, the thing that's different. That's what we didn't have 20 years ago, but we have it now.
Yes, and that's a fascinating part of your book, and I want to come to that shortly. But also striking for me was the extent that kleptocracy, or rule by thieves for people who are uninitiated with that word. And you talk about Russia's special role in the autocratic network as, quote, both the inventor of the modern marriage of kleptocracy and dictatorship, and the country now most aggressively seeking to upend the status quo. when you were looking into autocracies, did the degree of theft strike you?
So the degree of theft and the degree of wealth is so it's not just striking in contrast to the recent past. It's very striking in contrast to the 20th century. You know, Hitler and Stalin were not billionaires. Most modern dictators are billionaires. And we don't even know how or why they are billionaires. I mean, Xi Jinping clearly is very wealthy. His family is known to be very wealthy. Vladimir Putin is also meant to be perhaps the richest person in the world. All of them have secret funds, secret palaces, secret sources of income that we don't know about. And I think, again, you're quoting correctly. I mean, I believe that Russia paved the way for this kind of modern dictatorship, a marriage between great wealth and great power. And he did so along with another whole class of Russian oligarchs who learned exactly how to keep money secret. And they did so in part by using the Western financial system. So offshore tax havens, anonymous shell companies, anonymous investments. This is a whole class of people who learned how to essentially, I mean, it was more complicated than this, but essentially they learned how to steal money from Russia, to export it out of the country, to hide it in various places in Europe and America, or maybe New Zealand, Australia, and then to take it back into Russia and to use it as a way of both, you know, building comfort for themselves and their family, but also as a way of gaining power. You know, they bought up companies, they bought people, they bought influence, and that's how they rule. You know, and the way that Russia, in particular, also tried to exert influence around the world was also, once again, through its money. People were attracted to Russian money. They were attracted to the Russian oligarchs, not for any ideology. Once again, ideology is really secondary nowadays, but because they were rich. And if you hung around them, maybe you would get rich too. And that's very attractive to a lot of people, even people who aren't bothered one way or the other about dictatorship or democracy.
But you clearly see the Western financial institutions as enablers of
Absolutely.
this wealth.
Absolutely. I actually learned that from the Russian opposition. They were the ones who started tracking where is the money coming from, how are Putin and his cronies getting rich. And they traced it all back to Western banks and to Western money laundering operations. I mean, the Russians turbocharged something that had existed before. There was always this really very small, very elite world of offshore banking, which had some uses in the 1970s and the 1980s. It was the Russians who really saw that this was the way to hide their money. And now, of course, they're not the only ones. I mean, everybody does it. Chinese do it. You know, narco terrorists do it. Narco gangs do it. Everybody does it.
And we'll talk about that at the end when we look at some possible solutions. We'll return to that. But I'm fascinated in the degree to which Autocracy Inc., as you call it, works together. I mean, you write in your book that there is not some secret room where bad guys meet, as in a James Bond movie, but it's not a long way from that, is it? I mean, they are, the way you portray it, helping each other get rich and coming to the rescue of each other when the rest of the world is trying to shun them. You see this, don't you? When there are sanctions by much of the world, then these groups will help each other out. Lay it out for us, how much and how they are helping each other.
Yeah, as I said, some of it's not necessarily coordinated. It's not, there isn't, as I said, a secret room. But they do have different ways of keeping one another in power. So, for example, a great example is Venezuela, which is a country that might be about to be in the news again. Venezuela is a country that is collapsed. It's a country that was once the wealthiest country in Latin America. Now it's the poorest, and the leadership is very, very unpopular. There was a democratic election, semi-democratic election that was held last year, and the opposition, through kind of miraculously, won by a landslide and even managed to count the votes to prove that they'd won, and nevertheless the leadership wouldn't leave. How is that leadership staying in power, given its unpopularity, given that they've really destroyed their country? And the answer is Russian armaments, Chinese investment, Cuban assistance to the security system, also Chinese security apparatus, street cameras, spying, surveillance technology. And rather weirdly, given how different and far away Venezuela and Iran are, the Iranians have helped the Venezuelans a good deal in helping them get around sanctions, learn how to use, as I said, this secret international financial system, the one that exists alongside the real economy, also selling them equipment that they need for their oil industry. And so they began to cooperate, and they get things out of it. So the Iranians help the Venezuelans, and then in turn, the Venezuelans are believed to have helped give passports to Hezbollah operatives who were traveling in Europe. And so they do one another favors. They help one another get around international law, get around sanctions, and they see advantages. Again, it doesn't mean that they're ideologically close. I mean, it's hard to think of two countries that are more different than Venezuela and Iran, for all kinds of reasons. But they have their leaderships have this in common, and they seek to help one another out. And you can see that pattern in other places. You could see it in Belarus, for example, another country that should have collapsed a long time ago, government very, very unpopular. But it was rescued by the Russians, helped also by Chinese investment. Cubans and Nicaraguans and others recognized Belarus and helped them at the UN and diplomacy. And so they see it as a kind of, mutual aid society. Maybe that's putting it too strongly. But and I should say there's what is it that they all fear and why do they help one another other than mutual advantage? It's also because they all feel threatened by a common enemy. And the common enemy isn't the United States or NATO. The common enemy is the language and the ideas of liberal democracy. In other words, the way we talk. I mean, you asked me at the beginning, what is an autocracy? And I described it. There is also a different kind of political system in the world, and that's one where you have checks and balances, you have independent courts, you have rule of law, meaning that the law is separate from the people in power, and it has a status that they can't necessarily affect it. You have real opposition, you have actual public debate. And that system actually has a very deep appeal, often especially in the autocratic world. Maybe we who live in those kinds of countries, those kinds of political systems don't value it enough. But people who live in Russia and Iran who don't have rights do understand why it's important and are have at times been tried to fight for it. So you had the Russian opposition, the Navalny led an opposition that challenged the regime. You had the women's movement in Iran. You had the Hong Kong democracy movement. And the regimes, of the autocratic world know that these ideas have power, and they spend a lot of time thinking about how to push back against them. And when they see them having success, they're eager to make them fail. I mean, the war in Ukraine is happening partly because the Russian government wants to make sure that Ukraine doesn't succeed as a sovereign democracy. Because if it did, then why can't Russia be that too? Putin is worried about the effect on his own country of a victorious Ukraine.
Let's look for a moment about the way these autocracies control information. And again, it fits with your idea about, I suppose, the lack of ideological coherence. You're not seeing them use information to promote a worker and a sickle and some sort of utopian sort of vision or some sort of ideological purity. You seem to be saying in your book that they're promoting confusion and nihilism, really. What drew you to that conclusion, and why would you want to do that?
So there's some counterexamples of this, but this is, again, I think this starts in Russia, that what the Russians come to understand in the 2000s is that what really threatens their system is people who are organized and people who have clear ideas and people who are idealistic. And I think the leadership of Zimbabwe understands this, and the leadership of Belarus understands this. And so what they need is a form of propaganda that isn't merely supporting some kind of alternative ideal, which everybody knows could be seen through pretty easily nowadays. I mean, if you put the kind of, ladies driving tractors on TV that you had in the Soviet period, people would just laugh. Or even boastful attempts to boost the regime in ways that aren't credible. And so instead of doing that, what they do is they put out lots of different kinds of contrasting and contradicting information. They do deliberate disinformation. They launch conspiracy theories. And the point is to make sure that people don't believe in anything. I mean, their goal is not that everyone follows the leader, the way they tried to do in the 20th century. Their goal is to make everyone stay home. And they want a populace that is cynical, that is nihilistic, that believes, all politicians are crooks and even the opposition are crooks and everybody's corrupt. And so we might as well stay home. And that's what they want. And that's the nature of modern propaganda. And this is, of course, understood beyond the autocratic world, is really designed to demobilize. And in a lot of places, it's been quite successful. I mean, you can convince people that, if you can convince people rather that nothing is true, that you can't find out what actually happened, then why would they fight for it? Why would they fight for change if they can't even understand the present?
Well, that's a very elegant segue into talking about Donald Trump, isn't it? Because that is what we're seeing. You're in Washington, D.C. as you speak to me. I mean, that's what we're seeing. ABC or CNN or New York Times is dismissed as fake news. You have a president sort of retweeting AI-generated images of people dumping excrement on protesters at a No Kings March. I mean, some of it's silly, some of it's serious, but again, seems designed to confuse people and leave people wondering where the truth is. You've written recently...
So in this sense, I mean, not in every sense, I think Donald Trump has learned from the autocratic world, and maybe they've learned from him. So he understood that by putting out contradictory, crazy, bizarre statements, by mocking and laughing at existing sources of information, which, by the way, aren't only media, but they're also universities, research institutions, medical institutions, that by doing all of that, he disorients people. People don't trust anything. They don't trust the government. They don't trust any traditional sources of news or information. And then when you have a public like that, then you can mold reality for them. You can create an alternative reality where the U.S. economy is doing unbelievably well, even when it's not, which is the case at the moment. Or you can create a reality that, Donald Trump didn't commit crimes that we know he committed. Or you can create a reality that says he won the 2020 election when in fact he lost it. And so he uses that the fact that he's helped unmoor people. And I think, the sources of this lie deeper, and they lie in the nature of social media and so on. But Trump really took advantage of that disorientation that people now have, now that we spend so much time online, where it's much harder to determine what's real and what's not real. He took advantage of that disorientation and he deepened it. And now you do have a kind of disorientation. I mean, I think it's probably not just inside the United States where he's had that impact, almost everywhere.
So how much responsibility do you and I as journalists take for the lack of trust in the media and declining rates of trust? In New Zealand, we have shocking rates of trust in the media. And how much of it is apportioned to the kinds of tactics that we've been talking about today?
I mean, there are a lot of things happening at once. So as I said, Trump's tactics are specific, are one thing. We also live in a world where most people don't get their information from journalism. In other words, from people who do reporting or go out and find things out and then fact check them and bring them back. Instead, they get their information, if they get any news or about politics at all, they get it from podcasts, where people aren't fact checking. I mean, notice we're not doing that on this one. I mean, maybe there'll be time for it afterwards. Or they get their information from from social media, or they get it from YouTube. And so people aren't seeing fact-checked information anyway, because it's not the way in which information comes to them. I mean, another thing I think that social media did was it made it so that news isn't anymore something you go and look for. You don't pick up the newspaper in the morning and look to read it. Instead, it's what is served to you by an algorithm. And the algorithm is looking to find things you'll click on, things you'll be engaged in, and those things may or may not be actual information. They might just be conspiracy theories, or, I don't know, false information, or health programs that the algorithm thinks you'll find appealing. And so we're part of a whole kind of ecosystem that is now beginning to fail. And the ecosystem is beyond journalism. And it's a epistemological crisis. It's a crisis of knowledge itself. What do we know, and how do we know it, and how are these things possible? And as I said, it's touching universities, it's touching scientific research. I mean, in the US, that crisis is pretty profound. We now have, and this is another, maybe the strangest aspect of the Trump administration, is that we now have a Health and Human Services Secretary. That's our Secretary of Health in the United States, who is openly promoting vaccine conspiracy theories, openly promoting them. He's just changed the website of the Center for Disease Control, which is our most important health organization, to discourage vaccines. And this will result in people becoming sick and people dying, and baby children dying. And yet they persist in doing this based on, it's very hard to know exactly what their motive is. I mean, I think some of the motive is cynical, as we just discussed. It's to make people feel unmoored and lost. And some of it is madness. I mean, they believe in things that aren't true.
Okay, so we're seeing some symmetry in the information tactics used by autocracies and the Trump administration. We talked a little earlier about kleptocracy. I mean, where do you see Trump fitting into that scenario? Because by the reporting that I've read, he's enriched himself to the tune of about $3 billion more in the first year of this presidency. And there's so many examples. I mean, the crypto business, the overseas real estate deals in the billions. I mean, the luxury jet from Qatar. I know that's supposed to go to the presidential library at some point. But I mean, do you see him intentionally enriching himself in the way that these kleptocracies are doing, as you write in Autocracy Inc.? I mean, how does this behavior compare?
So that aspect of what he's doing compares almost directly. So that is actually, I mean, he is actually imitating what the Russians do, or what other autocrats do. In other words, seeking to convert political power directly into financial power, and using the infrastructure of cryptocurrency in particular as a way of just accepting bribes. I mean, he created a company called World Liberty Financial, which is really just that. I mean, people pay money into it with the expectation that that money will get them some kind of favor. And although you can't say it definitively, there are some odd coincidences. People who've paid money to his company being pardoned or having their investigations dropped if they're being investigated by the U.S. justice system, or countries who've paid in being granted various kinds of advantages. The Saudis are doing all kinds of different. Have all kinds of different business arrangements with the Trump family, for example. And does that explain why the U.S. is selling F-35s to Saudi Arabia, even though some people in the Pentagon are queasy about it? Maybe. I mean, but also the fact that we don't know is worrying. One of the key attributes of modern autocracy is secrecy. The fact that, again, we don't really know where the money goes. We don't know how it influences politics. And in the U.S., that's not supposed to happen. There used to be, Donald Trump has fired most of them, but there used to be ombudsmen, there used to be ethicists inside all the different public departments inside the administration, and usually they were called inspector generals. You had laws about conflict of interest, which, by the way, still apply to civil servants and to people in the military and elsewhere. But somehow they weren't explicitly designed to apply to the president. And Donald Trump has decided to just ignore them and wait and see if the law catches up with him some other time. And so you have absolutely a shift in the U.S. system from one where money was, at least for the time the president was in office, he was not supposed to be earning money from his decisions. And we now have a complete shift in that. I mean, then in other ways, you can see Trump seeking to consolidate power and seeking to create a system where checks and balances are muted, where the courts are less free, and so on. I mean, I don't know that he's going to succeed in doing those things. There's beginning to be a pushback in many different areas. There have been he's had a lot of legal setbacks recently, but that's his goal. His goal is to rule the way Putin rules or she rules, by himself, outside of the democratic system, the system of liberal checks and balances.
So, given all that, is Trump an autocrat?
He would like to be. Our system doesn't allow him to so easily, and there's still a lot of time. And there are a lot of different ways that people are now working to push back. I'm hoping, actually, that Congress, that particularly the Senate, but also even the House of Representatives, will begin to crack, particularly as people see how unpopular this is. Little things, there was Trump used a government bureaucrat to put pressure on Disney in order to get Disney to fire a comedian who was on a saying things that Trump and his movement didn't like on a television channel that Disney owns. That had a huge, terrible impact. I mean, there was a big backlash against it. People started boycotting Disney, And so there are limits to what this is able to do. There are pushbacks in the system. Americans, I think, understand that the president's not supposed to be able to ban comedians that he doesn't like. And it's very often not the big things. I mean, I think the kleptocracy and cryptocurrency story is very hard for people to understand, but some of these little changes are easier. I mean, actually, a few days ago, a Swiss delegation came to visit Trump to negotiate tariffs with him, and as a present, they brought a gold bar and a Rolex desk clock. And these are, by comparison to the billions of dollars in crypto, this is nothing. But people understood immediately, you don't hand the president a gold bar worth, it's like a kilogram gold bar worth $130,000, something like that. That's a bribe. And I think some of these things are beginning to create a reaction.
Yeah. Just 3 or 4 minutes to go. I wanted to talk a little bit about, at the end, about the implications for a country like New Zealand and what democracies and those who want to preserve them should do. I mean, one of the sort of calls to action that you make in the book is that citizens of these democracies should unite more and think of themselves as being linked together more. Do you think that
Absolutely.
is a solution?
So, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, France, Germany, Poland, you should think of these countries as your allies, and you should be working with all of them. There are also issues on which it's possible to create wide coalitions, including some countries that aren't strictly democracies, but aren't part of this Autocracy Inc. either. I mean, you can imagine there being an interest in pushing back against the offshore world from lots of countries, not only in Europe and Asia. You can imagine, what I think is going to be the coming argument about how to regulate the internet, by which I don't mean censoring it. I mean looking at how it's run, looking at how the algorithms work. You can imagine there being, room for New Zealand to cooperate with democracies in lots of different parts of the world on that too. I mean, the most important point is that the autocracies think globally. They think about, Iran helps Venezuela, China's watching what goes on in Belarus. And I think democracies need to think like that too. We need lines of connection between liberal democracies all over the world on specific issues, not merely through existing institutions. The EU is not going to do it by itself. But working around this, just working together to solve the same problems.
Just finally, Anne, your book is dedicated to the optimists. Are you among them?
I'm an optimist because I don't see an alternative. I mean, being an optimist doesn't mean that you aren't realistic. I would like to see and explain and describe the problems, and then I would like to work on fixing them. And I think that makes me optimistic. I should also say I have met people from really the worst and harshest countries in the world, from Russia, from China, from Iran. And they continue to work for change inside their own countries. So how can we, who live in free countries like the United States or New Zealand, how can we say, oh, it's all too hard and we can't work anymore? I think we really owe it to our fellow citizens and to our children, to continue believing that we can fix what's wrong with our system and we can fight back against the people who want to destroy it.
Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed our discussion. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
That was 30 Minutes with Anne Applebaum. This is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner, and we'll catch you next time. Ka kite.